Libra. This message isn't loud. It doesn't arrive with urgency or pressure or promises. It shows up quietly, right after you've grown tired of explaining yourself. If you've been holding things together for a long time, balancing people, expectations, and decisions that never fully felt like yours, you might notice something shifting lately. Not outside of you, inside. A pause where there used to be tension. A calm where you once felt rushed. And that's important, because some changes don't announce themselves. They don't demand action. They simply wait for you to notice that you no longer need to push the way you used to. If that feels familiar, stay with me for a moment. This isn't about what's coming next. It's about recognizing a rare shift that's already here. Libra. There's a kind of tiredness people rarely notice in you. Not the kind that comes from losing, not the kind that shows up as frustration or anger. It's quieter than that. It's the tiredness that comes from holding the middle ground for too long. From being the one who smooths things over. The one who notices what everyone else needs before asking what you need. You don't get exhausted because things fall apart. You get exhausted because you keep them together. And you do it so well that no one thinks to ask how heavy it's become. There's something I've learned about people like you. Balance doesn't drain you. What drains you is maintaining balance in places where it's no longer mutual. You give calm. You give fairness. You give understanding. But lately, something feels different. You may have noticed it in small ways. Moments where you pause before responding. Times when you don't rush to fix the tension in a room. Conversations where you let silence sit a little longer than usual. At first, that silence might have felt uncomfortable. Like you were doing something wrong. Like you were letting people down. But what if that silence isn't withdrawal? What if it's discernment? There's a quiet wisdom that comes with realizing you don't owe clarity to every situation. You don't owe peace to every conflict, and you don't owe access to everyone who asks for it. That's not selfish, that's maturity. I've seen this shift happen before, Libra, not loudly, not dramatically. It usually arrives after a long season of doing what felt right, even when it cost you more than you admitted. After you've spent enough time choosing harmony over honesty, or after you've said yes one too many times when your body was already saying no. And then, one day, you don't feel like explaining anymore. Not because you've shut down, but because you've tuned in. You begin listening inward to what settles you, to what steadies your breath, to what doesn't require you to perform balance, but allows you to live inside it. Here's something most people won't tell you. This kind of fatigue isn't a sign that you're off track. It's often a sign that you've outgrown the role you've been playing. And growth doesn't always ask for action right away. Sometimes it asks for restraint, for space, for the courage to let things be slightly unresolved while you regain your footing. So let me ask you something gently. When was the last time you allowed yourself to stop explaining and simply notice how something felt in your body? Not whether it was fair, not whether it made sense to others, just whether it felt sustainable. Because once you start listening at that level, something subtle begins to shift. Not around you, within you, and that internal shift, the one that arrives without urgency, without noise. That's where this next layer of your story quietly begins, and then something else begins to happen. Not all at once, not in a way you could easily explain to anyone else. The silence around you starts to feel different. There is a kind of silence you've always known, the awkward kind. The kind that shows up between two people when something goes unsaid. But this is not that silence. This is the silence that appears when you're no longer performing balance for the room, when you're not adjusting your tone, not softening your truth, not scanning the emotional temperature to make sure everyone stays comfortable. It's the silence of being with yourself, without commentary, without a role. At first, it might have felt unfamiliar, almost unsettling. You may have noticed you don't respond as quickly as you used to. You let messages sit a little longer. You don't rush to smooth over misunderstandings that aren't yours to fix. You don't immediately step in to correct the energy when something feels off. And if you're honest, part of you may have wondered, is something wrong with me? But nothing is wrong. This isn't detachment, it's discernment. There's a difference between checking out and stepping back, between indifference and awareness. What's happening now is that you're choosing where your energy belongs instead of offering it automatically. That's not cold, that's conscious. Most people never reach this point. They confuse peace with avoidance. They confuse silence with weakness. But you're beginning to understand something subtler. That silence can be a boundary without walls. That presence doesn't always require participation. That not every imbalance needs your hands on it. And this is why the shift feels rare, because very few people can step back without carrying resentment with them, without needing to prove a point, without turning their withdrawal into punishment. You're not doing that. You're simply listening. Listening to the moments when your body relaxes instead of tightens. Listening to the spaces where you don't feel pulled in 10 directions at once. Listening to what remains when the noise falls away. Here's a quiet truth I want to share with you. When silence stops feeling threatening, it's usually because you've stopped abandoning yourself inside it. You're no longer using movement to avoid feeling. You're no longer using fairness to override your own limits. And somewhere in that stillness, a new kind of clarity begins to form. Not the kind that demands answers, but the kind that changes how you move through questions. So let me ask you something gently. When you allow yourself to stay quiet, now does it feel empty or does it feel spacious? Because that difference matters more than you might realize. And as you stay with that space a little longer without rushing to define it, you may notice something else quietly taking shape. A moment where the need to push to decide to act begins to loosen its grip. And that moment, that soft release, is where the next turning point waits. And somewhere inside that quiet space, something else begins to loosen. Not the world around you, not the expectations, not even the questions. What loosens first is the pressure you've been putting on yourself. I remember a friend once saying something that stayed with me for years. He said the real shift didn't happen when he finally figured things out. It happened when he stopped demanding clarity from himself before he was ready. And when I hear your silence now, Libra, that's what it reminds me of. You may not have chosen a new path yet. You may not have named what comes next. But you've stopped walking the one that was quietly draining you. That matters more than you think. There's a subtle courage in not forcing a decision, especially for someone like you. Someone who's been trained to weigh every option, or to consider every angle, to make sure the choice feels fair, logical, and justified. But lately, something has shifted. You're no longer pushing yourself to decide just to relieve the tension. You're no longer choosing movement simply because stillness feels uncomfortable. Instead, you're allowing uncertainty to breathe. And that's not indecision. That's wisdom learning how to trust its own timing. Here's something most people misunderstand. Pressure doesn't always come from the outside. Sometimes it comes from an inner voice that believes progress only counts if it's visible. You've lived with that voice for a long time. The one that says, keep going, Keep fixing. Keep adjusting. Don't slow down now. But recently, you stopped listening to it the same way. Not because it disappeared, but because another voice got louder. A quieter one. One that says, you don't need to earn rest. You don't need to justify pausing. You don't need to know the destination to stop walking in the wrong direction. That's the rare turning point. Not a dramatic decision, not a bold announcement, just a quiet refusal to keep pushing yourself past your own limits. And maybe for the first time in a long while, you're noticing how your body responds to that choice. The way your shoulders drop when you stop forcing answers. The way your breath deepens when you admit you don't know yet. The way time feels less hostile when you're not racing it. So let me ask you something gently. When you imagine taking one more step forward right now, does it feel heavy or does it feel honest? Because that feeling is telling you something important. You're not stuck. You're not behind. You're recalibrating. And recalibration doesn't look like progress from the outside. It looks like stillness, like waiting, like choosing not to choose too soon. As you stay here a little longer, without forcing clarity, without demanding certainty, you may notice something else beginning to surface. A small signal. Almost easy to miss. Not a command, not a plan. Just a sense that when the next step arrives, it won't ask you to strain for it. It will meet you where you already are. And as you stay there, right where you are, without forcing clarity, without rushing the next step, something very subtle begins to appear. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't interrupt your day. It arrives the way quiet truths usually do. Almost politely. Almost easy to miss. Rare shifts don't come with noise. They don't demand your attention. They don't pressure you to act. They come as small signals. So small that the old version of you might have ignored them. A message that lands softly instead of urgently. An invitation that doesn't tighten your chest. An opportunity that feels calm, not electrifying. And then there's that thought. The one that surprises you with its simplicity. I don't need to rush this. That thought alone tells me something has changed. Because urgency used to feel familiar to you, even necessary. It felt like proof you were doing life correctly. But now, when something is truly aligned, it doesn't pull you forward. It meets you where you stand. You may notice it happening in unexpected places. A conversation that flows without effort. A pause that feels safe instead of awkward. A decision that doesn't ask you to explain yourself. These are not accidents, but they're also not instructions. They're signals. Quiet ones. Here's the part most people miss. When you stop pushing, the world doesn't stop responding. It responds differently. Instead of you chasing outcomes, outcomes begin to cross your path. Instead of proving readiness, you find yourself being recognized without effort. Instead of forcing timing, timing adjusts to your pace. That's not magic, that's reciprocity. It's what happens when you're no longer negotiating against your own nervous system. I've noticed this pattern again and again in people who've carried balance for too long. The moment they stop overcorrecting, life stops testing them with urgency. Not because everything becomes easy, but because it becomes honest. So if lately you've felt less driven by excitement, less fueled by pressure, less impressed by intensity, that's not loss of motivation. That's discernment sharpening. You're learning the difference between what stimulates you and what sustains you. And that difference matters more now than ever. Let me ask you something quietly. When something shows up in your life these days, do you feel pulled toward it, or do you feel met by it? Because being met carries a different energy. It doesn't rush you. It doesn't demand proof. It doesn't ask you to abandon your center. It simply stays long enough for you to notice it's there. And once you begin recognizing these signals, you start to trust something deeper than logic. You trust the pace that keeps you whole. As that trust settles in, almost without effort, your inner standards begin to shift. Not in dramatic ways, but in ways that quietly redefine what feels right. And that change in standards, that subtle recalibration inside you, is where the next layer of this story starts to take shape. And it's right there, in that quiet recalibration, that you begin to understand why this shift feels so rare for you. For most people, change announces itself through decisions, clear turns, bold moves, a visible before and after. But that has never been your truest language. As a Libra, you've always been taught that balance comes from fairness, from weighing both sides, from making sure everyone leaves the room feeling considered. And for a long time, that worked. It kept things smooth. It kept relationships intact. It kept the peace. But lately, peace has started to mean something else. Not fairness, not symmetry, not even agreement. Peace now feels like internal alignment. You may have noticed it without realizing what it was. Moments when something wasn't fair, but you didn't feel the need to correct it. Times when someone misunderstood you, and you let that misunderstanding exist without chasing it down. That's new for you. And it doesn't come from giving up. It comes from choosing differently. You're no longer asking, is this balanced for everyone? You're asking, is this sustainable for me? That single question changes everything. Because sustainability doesn't care about appearances. It doesn't rush. It doesn't perform. It simply lasts. I've seen many people confuse growth with intensity. They think transformation should feel dramatic, like clarity arriving all at once, like certainty replacing doubt overnight. But what you're experiencing is quieter than that. Your standards are shifting inward. You're choosing what steadies you over what impresses others. You're choosing what supports your long-term rhythm over what looks good in the moment. You're choosing environments where your nervous system can rest, not just endure. That kind of maturity rarely gets celebrated. Because it doesn't sparkle. It doesn't make noise. It doesn't announce itself on the outside. But it changes everything on the inside. Here's the part that makes this shift so uncommon. You're doing it without resentment. You're not withdrawing because you're angry. You're not pulling away to prove a point. You're not closing doors out of disappointment. You're simply choosing to live from a deeper reference point. And that requires a level of self-trust most people never develop. Let me ask you something gently. When you think about what you're allowing into your life now, does it feel lighter or does it feel truer? Because those are not always the same thing. What's happening here isn't a rejection of balance, it's a refinement of it. You're learning that real balance doesn't mean equal weight on both sides. It means weight placed where it can be carried. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. This is the kind of growth that doesn't rush you forward. It settles you deeper into yourself. And as that settling continues, something else begins to happen. Without effort, without strain. A sense that certain doors no longer need to be forced. They respond differently now. Almost as if they're listening for a quieter knock. And that's where the next movement begins. And then, almost without warning, you start to sense it. Not as a clear destination. Not as a bold announcement. More like a door you hadn't noticed before. Because it never needed to stand out. You may not have a name for it yet. It could look like a different kind of work. A quieter direction. Or simply a way of living that feels less negotiated. What matters isn't what the door leads to. It's how you feel standing in front of it. There's no rush in your chest. No spike of adrenaline trying to convince you this is it. Instead, there's a steadiness, a grounded sense of rightness, like your breath finally matching your pace. That's how you recognize it, not by excitement, but by alignment. For so long, excitement was the signal you trusted. If something made your heart race, you leaned in. If it felt intense, you assumed it was meaningful. But intensity doesn't always mean truth. Sometimes it just means familiarity. What's different now is the absence of strain. You're not rehearsing explanations. You're not calculating how this choice will be received. You're not bracing yourself for imbalance. You're simply present. And that presence changes how doors respond to you. Here's something I've noticed in moments like this. When you stop forcing outcomes, opportunities stop testing you. They don't challenge your worth. They don't demand urgency. They don't require you to shrink or overextend. They open at the speed your nervous system can follow. That's not coincidence. That's coherence. You may even find yourself surprised by how quietly things begin to move. A conversation that unfolds naturally. A possibility that stays available without pressure. A path that doesn't require you to abandon who you are to walk it. This is what it looks like when life meets you where you stand, instead of asking you to run ahead of yourself. And I know that can feel unfamiliar, because part of you may still be waiting for the catch, the test, the moment where balance must be earned again. But nothing asks that of you here. This door isn't responding to effort. It's responding to honesty, to the version of you that no longer confuses force with forward motion, to the part of you that knows stability isn't boring, it's nourishing. So let me ask you something softly. When you imagine stepping through this door, does your body tense or does it settle? That answer matters more than the details. Because this opening doesn't require certainty, or it doesn't ask for a declaration. It simply invites you to stay aligned as things unfold. And as you remain there, standing in that quiet readiness, another realization begins to form. One that has nothing to do with where you're going next, and everything to do with how you choose from here on. A choice that doesn't need to be defended, or proven, or explained. And that realization, the one that feels calm instead of dramatic, is where the final layer of this story gently comes into view. And from that quiet readiness, a choice begins to reveal itself. Not a decision you need to announce. Not a statement you owe the world. Just a way of standing inside yourself that feels settled. Libra. This rare shift doesn't ask you to prove anything. It doesn't require confidence on display. It doesn't need witnesses. It simply asks whether you can remain with what feels stable, even when it isn't exciting yet. That question has a different weight now. Earlier in your life, excitement was often the signal. Intensity felt like movement. Momentum felt like meaning. But excitement has a short attention span. It fades quickly. It asks to be fed again and again. What you're choosing now has a longer breath. It doesn't rush you forward. It doesn't flatter you into action. It doesn't promise immediate clarity. It offers continuity. And continuity is something you once underestimated. There's a quiet strength in choosing what doesn't need defending, in staying with a direction that doesn't need applause, in letting your life grow roots instead of chasing sparks. That strength doesn't feel loud, it feels grounded. You might notice it in how you move through your days, how you no longer rehearse explanations in your head, how you stop checking whether your choices make sense to others. You're not hiding. You're inhabiting your life more fully. And that's an important distinction. Most people think freedom looks like breaking away. But for you, freedom is beginning to look like staying. Staying with what nourishes you. Staying with what steadies your nervous system. Staying with choices that don't ask you to split yourself in two. This is why this ending doesn't feel dramatic. There's no final speech, no triumphant moment. Just a calm recognition that you don't have to start over again. Not this time. You've learned something fundamental about yourself along the way. That balance doesn't come from keeping everything equal. It comes from keeping yourself intact. So let me ask you one last thing, softly. When you imagine continuing forward from here without announcing it, without justifying it, without explaining it to anyone at all, does it feel like relief or does it feel like trust? Because trust is quieter than relief and deeper. If you feel even a trace of that trust settling in, that's enough for now. You don't need to rush what's growing. You don't need to rush yourself. This chapter doesn't end with certainty. It ends with stability. And that stability, the kind that holds without gripping, the kind that supports without demanding, is what allows the next season of your life to unfold without undoing everything you've built. So stay with what feels steady. Let it mature in its own time. There's no need to circle back to who you were. You've already stepped forward in the quietest way that matters. Libra. As we come to the edge of this moment, notice how quiet it feels compared to when we began. Nothing dramatic closed. Nothing collapsed. Nothing had to be proven. That alone tells you something important. Here's a small observation I want to leave you with. When life truly shifts, it often doesn't feel like movement. It feels like less resistance, less explaining, less bracing, less needing to check if you're allowed to feel at ease. So let me ask you this, gently. Where in your life are you still trying to earn calm instead of letting it arrive on its own? You don't need to answer out loud. In fact, tonight, try something simple. When you're done listening, sit in silence for 1 full minute. No fixing, no planning. Just notice what part of your body softens first. That's usually where truth speaks before words do. There's no rush to name what's next. Some paths ask to be felt long before they're understood. And for you, Libra, that's not avoidance. That's wisdom maturing. I'll say this quietly. The most powerful choices you're making right now are the ones you don't feel the need to announce. If this message stayed with you, let me know in the comments what felt steady instead of exciting. Those reflections help this space stay real. And if you're still here, if you've walked this whole journey with me, consider subscribing, not for predictions, but for these moments of pause we share. Trust yourself tonight, more than you did yesterday. We'll talk again soon. The next message is already taking shape.